Greetings, cats. It's been a while, indeed. Yeah, welcome to the Jazz Disciple channel, the one place where we don't just listen or post albums, but we actually talk a little bit more about the music. The last time we had a chat, we looked at part one of the South African jazz story with a special focus on Abdullah Ibrahim. I thought of following up that story and doing a part two of the South African jazz story. But tonight I chose a topic which I call the South African jazz soundtrack of the 60s. This is a very important era in the evolution of the South African jazz story in many ways. And some critics will argue whether this was the golden era of our jazz or rather the period before that. I'll leave you to be the judge. But my view is that the 50s was a critical era in the development of new sounds, people coming together, exploring. And the 60s is where it all came together as a product. Yeah? So we started our journey in 1959. And why 1959? Because 1959 is the date where the King Kong musical, the first jazz opera that was performed, and it produced an album. But what was special about this project is the talent involved in it, from the brains around production to composition to playing. We had the likes of Tot Machikiza, who was not just a pianist but also a composer of note, combining with the likes of McKay Davashe. It featured Miriam Makeba as one of the key members of the cast. And of course, some of the Manhattan brothers, especially Ubaba Mdlele, who I think assumed the role of King Kong. This play played a critical role in the history of South African jazz. It would also act as a catalyst to enable some of our artists to travel abroad, and some went into exile. But also in 1959, an American scholar and journalist by the name of John Mehigan traveled to Johannesburg on an exchange program, started mingling with, I call the Doke House crowds, right? And there he would come across the trio of Jonas Gwangwa, Hugh Masekela, and Brakippi Moeketsi. And soon the apartheid government did not like this white man mingling with black people, and they had to cut his trip short. But before that happened, an important album was recorded with those three gentlemen, with John on the piano and some other cats. I think the Shanga brothers, the one on the bass and the one on the penny whistle. And they produced this album called Jazz in Africa. It came in 2 volumes, true bop setting, beautiful execution. Man, you could swear that these were cats that have been playing in the American scene for a while. We then move from 1959, we go into the 60s. I think previously we did mention the Jazz Epistles and Abdullah's plays Fierce Monk. But 1960 was a critical year because as soon as Miriam Makeba got to the US, going into exile, she had an opportunity to record her debut album, self-entitled Miriam Makeba, produced by Harry Belafonte. Hey, the African melodies were now getting a world stage, when fused with other sounds and rhythms from other places. In 1962, as we continue with this soundtrack of the 60s, Hugh Masekela would record his debut album also in the US, titled Trumpet Africaine. And it was indeed the sound of an African trumpet, weaving in sounds that Hugh had picked up in the West Coast, some pop, but also bringing in the African melodies and rhythms to the sound. Then I would like to talk about Orlando Stadium. Now, Orlando Stadium is famous for, in Soweto, it's famous for football. But in the early 60s, that venue, as well as the Jabavu Amphitheater, played host to a number of great jazz festivals. And these jazz festivals, sponsored by Castle Lager beer brand, would serve as an important catalyst to enable artists to even record, because these were not just festivals, but they were also competitions. Cats would come from all walks of all corners of the country, and they would present their music, and the winners would be rewarded with a recording company. So 1963, Chris McGregor with his Capetonians, ascended on Orlando Stadium. And on board they dished out a very beautiful big band sound. That's what you're hearing playing in the background. And then later they would then go and record in 1963 September to produce, I think, probably one of the most beautiful big band album out of South Africa, led by Chris McGregor, which featured the likes of Kippie Moeketsi, the likes of Mongezi Feza, Dudu Pukwane, Ili Mabuza, I think, on drums, or something like that, yeah. The winners of the 1964 installment of the Orlando Stadium Jazz Festival, which happened to be the Malombo Jazzmen, and the runners-up was the Ili Mabuza Quartet. The Malombo Jazzmen, of course, was Dr. Philip Tabane, Julian Bahula on the Malombo drums, and A.B. Tindi. And then the Ili Mabuza Quartet had Ili Mabuza on drums, Brabani Chabane on alto, and then you had Ernest Motley on the bass, and Pat Machikiza on piano. I mean, this was the importance of these events, because they helped these guys to able to record. Then we move into go back to 1962, because something very important happened. A gentleman by the name of Gideon Nxumalo, Mgibe as he's well known, was commissioned by Wits University to write a score for the jazz festival. And he pulled together an amazing band. He brought in a Dudu Pukwane from the Cape, Makaya Ntsoko, brought in Martin Mkijima, and what came out of there was this jazz fantasia, very progressive music, post-bop in nature, free jazz in nature. And this, I think for me, is one of the most important albums in South African jazz evolution. 65, we saw the Manhattan Brothers, and then back in exile, Chris McGregor reassembled the Blue Notes in 1968 to record again with them. This is after they left in 1964, and they, recorded their farewell album in Durban. Gideon Nxumalo would come back again in 1968 to produce another album called Gideon Plays. Hey, 68 was a busy year, because this is the year where Mankunku also recorded the historical, monumental Yakali Nkomo, an important album, that is an essential in South African jazz. Also in 68, Chris Schilder, featuring Mankunku, would record the famous Spring, Springtime in the Cape. A beautiful album which also features Gilbert Matthews on drums.